They are the ones that made all of the decisions during the Cuban Missile Crisis, including our overflights, whether we would have them or not. And they are also the ones that decided that we needed now to have low-level aircraft flying to take pictures that even a barber could identify what was there and accept it. These were the aircraft that were used. You had a Navy aircraft and an Air Force aircraft that were used to take the low-level pictures. They flew about 1,500 feet off the ground. Here's one of the pictures. It shows in the upper left the launch pad. That's the white concrete. You'll see an object in there, one end. That's the launch platform for the missile. And then you see circled or two of the missiles under canvas cover. Subsequent to that coverage being provided, made a press release to the press, and myself and my boss, John Hughes, we together put together a package of photos to be released unclassified. Took them over to the White House to Pierre Salinger for his approval. There was Pierre sitting in his easy chair drinking a beer. It had been hot, and we'd been working late. And that rascal, he never even offered us a Coke, much less a beer. So he's sort of low on my totem pole. But anyway, this release was made, and we had a briefing that was given to the United Nations. And you see the Deputy Director of INPIC, Colonel Clark, and then you see the real white head that's shining. That's Adlai Stevenson with his bald head. The Soviet ambassador there to the UN was silent throughout the presentation. We had a little fun. Everything was so tense throughout this, so I selected this picture to include it in my briefing one morning to all of to McNamara and all the other guys in the Joint Chiefs, and it went over well. I think you might be able to know what he was saying, but the guy, wait. The guy's right here, and he's looking up at the aircraft, and on the original photography, you could actually see that he had his mouth open. You can imagine how he felt. We also, soon after that, we had the U-2 that was shot down. There was the pilot, Major Anderson, was shot down by a surface-to-air missile from one of those sites, and he was killed by shrapnel. This was our first evidence that the Soviets were actually going to heed our quarantine. And by the way, the term quarantine was selected, which means exactly the same thing as blockade, but in diplomatic language, blockade is an act of war. So this was a quarantine, but this showed the ship making a turn to go back to the Soviet Union. And it was actually carrying components for the intermediate range ballistic missile on its deck. We also had ships that boarded other ships coming in just to make sure they were not bringing anything in. And this one happened to be the SS Joseph P. Kennedy. This is a picture. If you look in the bottom right, you'll see the aircraft shadow that's taking the picture. And then within the circles, we have missile transporters that had been loaded onto the deck of the ships for taking back to the Soviet Union. Then we had to be sure that there were missiles on the board as they went out. And you had both air and surface surveillance of the ships going out, and the Soviets were required, as we came up alongside to inspect, to bring the canvas cover back so you could be sure there was a missile fuselage underneath. We were able to confirm that they all left. And during this, when we finished up with the Cuban Missile Crisis, or actually got started with it, I had started night school at Georgetown Law Center in Washington. It was, you see this building, guys, think about it. You go into night school from 5:30 to 7:30, and you've been working all day, and here's this gloomy, gloomy building. It really was gloomy. Since then, they have replaced that with a magnificent campus for the law school. But it was pretty bad, and what we would do is about every 4 to 6 weeks, a group of us would go and say, to hell with the class. We would go down to the corner to the local beer skeller, and we would discuss, not law, but other things. In any case, graduated from that in '62. I was going to take the bar exam, but the Cuban Missile Crisis interrupted, and so I took it in '63. Then I went back to the Pentagon to work, and there it was not as interesting. A lot of jobs, but if you wanted to get promoted and make a little more money in the government, you had to lead something, head up an office. So I did that, among other things, during that period of time, '63 to '75. And during that same period, we had additions to our overhead collection, particularly the satellites. This is one, it's called KH-8. It took very high quality imagery, so you could do very detailed analysis of the physical characteristics of facilities as well as weapons. Had the KH-9, which did area coverage, very similar to what you can get now from the commercial satellites. I also then went in '76, went to the National War College, which was like a vacation in a way, sabbatical. It was great. A lot of stories about trips we've taken, but that's for over dinner. Then after that, I worked for the National Intelligence Staff on detail from the Defense Intelligence Agency for those years, and the focus there was on putting together a national coordinated program for all of the imagery exploitation or analytical elements to work together and to provide reporting in a format that was uniform that allowed each person to share the information they got. That was successful. We did have the plan. And one of the things I learned there is always good to have a red herring in what you're proposing, because everybody needs to have a victory. And so I and my partner created a red herring. That saved the day because we reluctantly gave up on it at the end. But everything else was approved by all of those organizations. Starting on the left, you have the National Reconnaissance Office, Central Intelligence Agency, National Photographic Interpretation Center, National Security Agency, State Department, Energy, Defense Intelligence Agency, Defense Mapping Agency, and the services. Those were the 12 organizations we had to coordinate with and get approval to do anything. Also during that period, in '76, we had the near real-time system that came on board. And that was, if you can thank the research that was paid by the taxpayers for this system, because all your digital cameras using that technology. And with the KH-11, it had a site where it received the imagery, and it had imagery analysts there to analyze it in near real time. They were able to get the photos in about 30 minutes after it had been taken. And I went to work there during that period of '81 to '85. And my children and family called it Never Never Land because it was classified location. So they never knew where I worked, but it was somewhere in the Washington area. And once again, we had all those same 12 organizations involved, and they were approving the tasking, in other words, the priorities for taking pictures. And with our satellites in any system, you cannot take every picture that you want. You have competition. And so my job was to work with these people to coordinate and get them together on what the priorities for tasking the satellites were for collection. And when I got there, I went 2 months to the meetings, and then everything was done by majority rule. I told them the next meeting, I said, guys, as long as you guys make the right decision on the priorities, then we all get a pat on the back. But if you screw up on the priority sometime, there's only one guy in the room that gets his butt kicked, and it is I. Therefore, in the future, if I think you've made the wrong decision, then we're not going to do it. You can go back home. I'll tell you what you can tell your boss. Your boss can appeal, and if the appeal gets to me that I shouldn't have done it, so be it. But it worked fine, and I never had one come back. Went to the senior seminar for the State Department. Their facility was in the Circle building there, right across from the Marriott. You could see the airplanes coming in, landing, going down the river. Another great experience. And I ended up 2 years in the National Intelligence Staff as assistant to director. Basically, it was my stacking of pencils period before retirement. I retired. I worked for Booz Allen. Again, their offices were in Roslyn, in Arlington, Virginia. Worked for them 9 years. This was our incentive for retiring and moving to Hilton Head. That's our home in Arlington. We had a 2-foot snow the year before, and I said, Ellie, that's it. We're leaving. One other. Okay. That's it, guys. Okay, if you have any questions before you get to go have another drink and dinner, I'll be glad to answer if I can.
Great presentation. Any questions, John?
Yeah. You got a question?
When the Soviets were in Cuba,
Yeah.
how many missiles could they launch at a time?
You launch one at a time from each launch pad, and then they had at least one additional one to be able to refire.
And what was the range? How far into the U.S. did they shoot?
The medium-range ballistic missile only went about 1,000 miles, and that got you to Washington, D.C. The intermediate-range ballistic missile had a 2,000-plus mile range, and it would cover most of the targets in the United States. But the one that was operational at the time of the crisis, or toward the end of the crisis, was only the medium-range ballistic missile, and but it can get to Washington. Remember, Ellie called me one time and said, should she get some canned goods and stuff for the family? I said, Ellie, we're ground zero. Don't worry about it. Which we were, yeah. Does that answer your question?
No, one more.
We have a question here.
One more.
Yep.
Did they ever get to the point where they actually could launch the missiles?
Oh, yes. That's what I meant by being operational.
Okay.
Yes, they were capable of, in our view, they were capable of launching
Okay, thank you.
before the
John, what was our
What?
What was our counter capability of missiles at the same time?
We had about 150 ICBM launchers operational, whereas they had about 25.
They could have gone to Cuba?
Yes. One night, ours could go anywhere, yes. Yeah. We also had intermediate range ballistic missiles.
We have a question in the back.
John, how come when you're paid a tax dollar, you're paid by tax dollars, you look so good, so tan, so relaxed? There's something about, in the middle of the war.
Would you speak up?
You don't want to hear him.
What was that again? I don't want to hear it?
Any other questions?
Yeah, John, how did you get all those pictures you just showed us? Weren't they classified?
No. Okay, the pictures of the Cuban Missile Crisis, those all came from the package that my boss, John Hughes, and I put together and reviewed with Pierre Salinger. And they were all declassified at that time. So they've been available for years. But the intelligence community has a practice that after 25 years, you review the material associated with a particular event and to make a decision as to whether they can be declassified. That decision was made relative to the KH-4 Corona satellite imagery. All that was declassified and you could use it. The U-2's photography, the same. So it broadened the area of being able to get photos. What was really helpful in getting photography was the commercial imagery collectors with all of their imagery, which the quality of that is amazing. It was as good as our best area search type imagery. But that's where I got the imagery from. And in fact, I kept a packet of all of the ones that we declassified and gave to the press. And some of those I have framed in the house. Other questions?
Any other questions? One here. Jay?
Did the U.S. make concessions as part of a bigger deal to get the Soviet missiles out of Cuba?
Yes, sir. What they did was, well, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had intermediate range ballistic missiles deployed both in Italy and in Greece. Turkey, Italy and Turkey. And the ones in Turkey were really an old intermediate range ballistic missile, the Jupiter, which was developed in Huntsville, in the Army. That one was really out of date, and we were planning to remove those from Turkey. But we hadn't done it before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then during the crisis, that was one of the things that Khrushchev was requested that they be removed. And Kennedy, that was in his second of two letters. The first letter, Khrushchev was only demanding that we agree not to invade Cuba. Then he said, the next day he sent a second letter and said, no, I want you to also remove the missiles. Kennedy decided to ignore the second letter. He responded to the first letter, and then he later got a response back from Khrushchev on that one. It says, I appreciate very much your appropriate action and and judgment. He really recognized it. We were fortunate, guys, to have Kennedy as president. Because one time I was there with the ex-com when they were discussing particularly what to do in retaliation. And the military, of course, wanted to attack. You had, and most of the other civilian appointees also, officials supported them. But there were a few that said no, not to do that. And I remember we got to stay a few minutes longer after the briefing. And Kennedy said, hey guys, says, we have got to we cannot back them into a corner. We've got to come up with something that allows them to back out gracefully. And by God, they did. Does that answer your question?
Any other questions? Well, thank you, John, for an outstanding presentation. Thank you. We hope to see you all next February. Carol Cook will be our speaker, and we are looking for future speakers. So if you'd like to tell your story, please see me. Thank you very much. Have a good dinner.